Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Mesechet Sheviit. We're up to Perek Aleph, Mishnah Gimel. Today's Mishnah should be Le'ilui Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbaev, Menuchato Began Eden, Amen. Yesterday's Mishnah, we defined a field of trees based on the amount of figs that each tree can produce. The Mishnah today is going to explain that the same rule applies to other species of trees as well. Echad ilan serak, whether they are non-fruit trees, meaning trees that you plant for wood, and the Mefarshim explain, as long as there's moisture in the ground, plowing is beneficial for the tree because it thickens its trunk. After this time, plowing can damage the tree. So echad ilan serak, whether they are non-fruit trees, echad ilan ma'achal, or any type of tree that produces any edible fruit, ro'in otan kilu hem te'enim, we view them as if they were fig trees. Therefore, if fig trees of such a size would each produce a loaf of pressed figs weighing 60 Italian maneh, which we said yesterday was the equivalent of 63 pounds, then we can plow the entire betzah for their benefit after Pesach, until, according to Bet Shammai, when it's no longer beneficial for the fruits, or according to Bet Hillel, until Shavuot. Pachod mikan. However, if fig trees of such a size would produce less than this amount, and choshim lahem ela letzolkan, we may only plow their need, meaning their immediate surroundings, which we said was actually under the tree and the 2 amot surrounding it. And then the Mefarshim explain, the Rav tells us that the Chachamim based the calculation on the produce of a fig tree. Why? Because of its large fruit and its high output. And Reb Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal in his Bi'ur on Mesechet Sheviit explains that the difference between the amount of fruit produced by a large tree and a small one is more evident when it's a fig tree. Therefore, it makes it easier to calculate the output of a fig tree by knowing its size. Therefore, we use this as an example for the tree. So if this tree specifically would have been a fig tree, if it would be able to produce 63 grams of pressed figs, then you'd be able to plow the entire betzah. But now, Rabotai, we're going to explain that even though we said in a field of trees the entire betzah can be plowed after Pesach of the 6th year, we're going to now qualify what it is to be considered a field. For a field to be considered a field of trees, there have to be at least 3 trees growing in the field. In addition to having 3 trees, each one of the trees must be large enough to produce a block of dried figs. So the Mishnah is going to discuss further now and teach the law that applies when the trees do not meet this requirement. Let's say one of the trees produces a block of pressed figs, but the other 2 do not produce that amount. Or even if 2 of the trees produce that amount, but one does not produce that amount, and we may plow for the trees only as much as their individual needs, meaning their immediate surroundings, which we said is the area directly beneath the tree plus the space outside the tree's branches for a fruit picker in his basket, which was 2 amot. We are not allowed to plant the entire betzah. Why? Since not all the trees are large enough, the field is not considered a field of trees. And now the Mishnah is going to teach that this requirement that each tree has to be large enough to produce a block of dried figs does not always apply. Ad shiyu mishlosha v'ad tisha. The requirement that each tree must be large enough to produce a block of dried figs applies when the field contains between 3 to 9 trees. Meaning, if, for example, the field contains 9 trees and 3 of them are the minimum, but the other 6 are not, it is not considered a field of trees. Even though you have 3 trees that are the necessary size, the other smaller trees within the betzah disqualify it. This is how the Mefarshim explain it. However, hayu asara me'asara ulmala, if there were 10 or more than 10 trees in the field, ben osin, ben she'en anosin, choshim kol betzah b'shvilan, then we don't care, regardless of whether they produce the minimum amount of fruit or they do not produce the minimum amount of fruit. We may plow the entire betzah for their benefit, meaning a field of 10 or more trees is considered a field of trees, regardless of the amount that the trees produce. Now, Rabotai, the Mishnah stated earlier that if the 3 trees do not meet the minimum size requirement, only the immediate area, their immediate area can be plowed, not the entire Bet Se'ah. And the Mishnah was going to bring the source for the prohibition of plowing the rest of the Bet Se'ah. It's also going to explain the basic law that prohibits plowing a field when it's not beneficial for the crop of the 6th year. Shneimar, the pasuk says, "Becharish ubakatzir tishbot." The pasuk, this is the middle of the pasuk. the pasuk begins, 6 days you shall work, and on the 7th day you shall rest. And the pasuk that the Mishnah is quoting is the continuation. During plowing and during harvesting you shall rest. So now there's 2 ways to learn this verse. We're going to go with the first way to learn this. So the first words of the pasuk are obviously speaking about Shabbat, right? So 6 days you shall work, on the 7th day you shall rest. But the final words, when we say Becharish ubekatzir tishbot, during plowing and during harvesting you shall rest, they're puzzling. Why? Because if those words are also speaking about Shabbat, since it's the same pasuk, that's a little difficult. Why? Because we know already that you can't do melachot, including plowing and harvesting, on Shabbat. It was already taught in a different place, as the Rav quotes to us. It says, Sheshet yamim ta'avod v'asita kol melachtecha. Right? It already says you're not allowed to do melacha. So then why is it repeating it now? So the way that this Tanakama learns the final words of the verse, that they're not speaking about Shabbat, they're speaking about Shemitah instead of Shabbat, and the pasuk is speaking about the prohibition of plowing and harvesting during Shemitah, meaning the pasuk is teaching us that on those days that the Torah says you shall work, meaning weekdays, during plowing and during harvesting you shall rest, meaning there's a time even during the weekday when plowing and harvesting is asur, apparently referring to the year of Shemitah. There's no need for the pasuk to teach me that plowing and harvesting are asur during the actual year of Shemitah, because that also says in the Torah already says that you can only work on it during the 6 years. So obviously it's not teaching me about Sheviit itself. So since the pasuk is not needed to prohibit harvesting during the Shemitah, we can assume that it's also not speaking about plowing during Shemitah. Ela, rather, the Tana says, Charish shel erev Sheviit shehu nichnas b'Shviit. The pasuk is prohibiting plowing on the erev Sheviit, the erev Shemitah, which is the 6th year, whose effect enters Shemitah, meaning plowing during the 6th year for the benefit of a crop that's going to be harvested in the 7th year is asur. V'katzir shel Sheviit shu yotzeh lamotzeh Sheviit. Likewise, harvesting the 7th year's crop, meaning it was either planted against the halacha or it grew on its own from seeds that were accidentally left on the ground, that extends into the year following Shemitah, meaning the pasuk is teaching us 2 things. Number 1, you cannot plow before Shemitah if the crop will be harvested during Shemitah. And you're not allowed to harvest a Shemitah crop even after Shemitah. That is, Rabotai, how this Tana learns this pasuk of Becharish ubekatzir tishbot. He learns it, like we said, 2 lessons. Number 1, you cannot plow before Shemitah if the crop will be harvested after Shemitah. And number 2, you cannot harvest the Shemitah crop even after the Shemitah year ends. Now, Rabbi Yishmael disagrees with this interpretation. Rabbi Yishmael says the pasuk is not talking about Shemitah, it's talking about Shabbat. Now, even though the prohibition of plowing and harvesting on Shabbat, we already know from a different pasuk, the reason we mention it here is to compare the Isur of plowing on Shabbat to the prohibition of harvesting on Shabbat, and to teach Ma cherish reshut af katzir reshut. Just like plowing that the Torah prohibits on Shabbat is voluntary, meaning it cannot be speaking about a case where a mitzvah obligates a person to plow, right? There's no such mitzvah in the Torah. So too, when the Torah says you cannot harvest on Shabbat, it's talking about harvesting that's voluntary, meaning that the Isur to harvest on Shabbat does not apply to a mitzvah of harvesting. What kind of mitzvah you have harvesting? Yatzak kitzira omer. This excludes harvesting barley for the omer offering, which is a mitzvah. Therefore, Rabbi Yishmael says that this pasuk is teaching me that you can even harvest the omer offering, the barley for the omer offering, even on Shabbat. And the Varshim explained to us that the omer is an offering of barley that's brought on the 16th of Nisan. It's brought down in Sefer Vayikra. The barley is from the new crop that ripens at the time of the year. According to Rabbi Yishmael, the barley has to be harvested on that day specifically for the purpose of the omer, even if there was other harvested barley available. according to Rabbi Ishmael, the pasuk is telling me that if the 16th of Nisan falls out on Shabbat, the mitzvah to bring the Korban Omer overrides the Isur of harvesting on Shabbat. So according to Rabbi Ishmael, who's explaining that the Mishnah's pasuk of Becharish Bekatzir Tishbot is talking about Shabbat, according to him, there's no pasuk in the Torah that prohibits plowing before Shemitah. There's no such source. However, Rabbi Ishmael also agrees that there is an Isur D'Oraita against plowing at that time, even though there's no actual written pasuk. He learns it from a Torah Moshe Sinai, an oral law that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu on Sinai when you don't need a pasuk, when there's no pasuk given. Now, what's the difference between having a pasuk in the Torah and learning it from Moshe Rabbeinu on Sinai? There's a practical nafkamina, practical difference. Why? Because if the halacha, if the law is learned out from a pasuk, it even applies nowadays as well. But if it would be learned as an oral law to Moshe Rabbeinu that you cannot plow before Shemitah, that would only apply when the Beit Mikdash is standing. That you have to look in the Gemara Masechet Mod Katan on page 4a. Rabban Gamliel and his court, Rabban Gamliel Ubed Dino, they ruled like the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael. And nowadays, when the Beit Mikdash is no longer standing, you're allowed to plow until Shemitah actually begins, until the Rosh Hashanah of that Tishrei, of that year. That is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.